This is gonna get weird, y'all. We're gonna talk about some strange things today because did you catch the first line of our passage? Paul writes to the church in Corinth, I know a person in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven, whether in body or out of the body. I don't know, God knows. Huh? Caught up to the third heaven? Hearing revelations that no mortal is permitted to repeat. Are we just going to pass over that? Actually, that's usually what we do in my experience. In 36 years, I've never heard anybody preach on this first part of this passage that's set in the lectionary for this fifth Sunday in Pentecost. Any mention of it at all is usually only made to then disregard it and then to move on to the more important, much more relatable second half of the passage, which is about weaknesses and suffering. And I get it. I mean, it's weird. And there is legitimate hermeneutical reason, interpretive reason, for choosing to bypass it since Paul himself seems reluctant to talk about it. So here's the context. The church in Corinth is fractioning, and many are starting to turn against Paul because a group of missionaries have come into the community and they are preaching a different version of the gospel, a different Jesus, a different spirit. We don't know exactly what they were teaching, but by Paul's reaction and remarks, I feel that it's something that was akin to the health and wealth prosperity gospel, the kind that says the bigger your bank account, the more God loves you. If you get hurt or sick, that's because you didn't believe enough. And if you want God to bless you, then send me more money. So Paul is just torn up. He says that he is riddled with anxiety about what's going on. And he is personally getting dragged through the mud because these super apostles, which is what he sarcastically calls them, are winning the Corinthians over in two main ways, by tearing Paul down and by lifting themselves up. So they criticize everything about Paul, including his appearance and his speech. Apparently, there was something about Paul's bodily physique that they could pick on. He may have had a disability or an illness, so they call him weak. And they say that his speech is worthless, likely because he wasn't trained in the art of rhetoric the way that they were. And then they lift themselves up. They brag about their ethnic heritage, their mastery over adversity, and about these impressive spiritual experiences that they've had. And they do this because in the ancient world, ecstatic experiences were used to validate one's spiritual authority. It was like a divine stamp on your resume. So in his defense, Paul writes to the Corinthians and he tells them, look, I'm a descendant of Abraham as well. I have endured countless trials and tribulations in my work for the gospel. And yes, if you must know, I too have experienced things so transcendent that I can't even put them into words. See, because when Paul says, I once knew a person who was caught up to the third heaven, he's talking about himself in third person, as a way to share the experience without taking credit for it, without boasting about it. It's important to note that Paul doesn't disregard mystical experiences as trivial or non-essential. He confesses to his own because I think he and we can understand why the Corinthians were fascinated by these stories. Ever since humankind could conceive of it, we have been utterly curious about the beyond. Just think about the kinds of movies and TV shows we watch, or the kinds of books and stories that activate our imaginations. And maybe you're like me, someone who would proudly only watch documentaries and only read nonfiction for a big part of my life because I was serious, no time for nonsense. But even science is actively pursuing a renaissance in its exploration of the mystical. The story of how science got here is long, but basically, the revival of this particular vein of research started up again in the 1990s. And since then, several studies using psychedelic compounds like psilocybin have been completed and are currently underway at prestigious institutions like Johns Hopkins, NYU, and UCLA. And the results are fascinating. When psychedelics are administered in combination with the right set and setting, which includes professional guides who help navigate the psychedelic trip, participants undergo what scientists are calling mystical experiences that can have profound and lasting positive effects. At rates of like 80% in many of these trials, after just one experience, one trip, cancer patients lose their fear of death, depression and anxiety that has been resistant to other drugs falls away, chronic alcoholics and smokers overcome their addictions. These are unprecedented results in the field of psychopharmacology. So what is going on in these people's minds that is enabling this kind of radical transformation? Well, from the testimonies that have been published, it sounds a lot like Paul's in-body, out-of-body, third-person, God knows what's going on here experience. Even though each trip is uniquely bizarre in its own way, these psychedelic journeys seem to follow somewhat of a similar path. Often, the participant first feels themselves going up and out into some sort of space beyond earth, beyond body. And then they begin to undergo something quite terrifying as they witness in truly strange and vivid ways the dissolution of themselves, of their ego. I heard the comedian podcaster Joe Rogan talking with Michael Pollan, the journalist who has a new book out on the science of psychedelics, talking to each other about their experiences on DMT, and both of them rocketed up into space. For Joe Rogan, it was a fun ride. For Michael Pollan, it was not. It was so intense that Pollan thought he was literally dying, which is a common feeling of fear that folks encounter in these experiences. But then he found, as most of the research participants do, for instance on psilocybin, that if you surrender to the journey, to the death, then it starts to get interesting. You begin to become third person as the little I that you are begins to float away, and then what's left of you becomes nothing and everything. When neuroscientists started taking images of brains that were undergoing a psychedelic trip, they expected to see a huge increase in brain activity because of all the crazy things that these participants report seeing and feeling. But instead, they found that the brain got really quiet. specifically in the DMN, the default mode network, the part of the brain that links the prefrontal cortex to older centers of memory and emotion. This is important because that process that links the prefrontal cortex to memory and emotion is what we're really operating on all the time. Our brains are wired to be as efficient as possible. So as we go throughout our days, we take in as little sensory information as we can, because that's time and energy consuming. So when you look at a row of houses or a group of people, your brain actually takes very little data in from your senses, and instead it immediately dips into your memory, into your backlog of experience to tell you what you're perceiving. What does this mean? For the most part, you are not really seeing what you are looking at. Throughout the day, your brain is just making super fast, highly educated guesses, a process that neuroscientists call predictive coding. The good thing about this, says Paulin, is I'm seldom surprised. The bad thing is I'm seldom surprised. By turning down the default mode, which is what it appears that psychedelics do, your capacity for awe and wonder gets flipped on. And this is a big deal because apparently the wonder that comes with seeing the world as if for the first time induces a kind of gratitude and understanding that has the power to change everything if it is properly integrated into your life, which is why the role of the right guide has proven to be so vital. True mystical experiences aren't about escapism. On the contrary, there seems to be a direct line between the heights of mysticism and the depths of human suffering. After Paul mentions his mystical experience, he goes straight into talking about his wounds and his weaknesses. And he writes that God has revealed to him that power is made perfect in weakness. Thus, Paul declares, whenever I am weak, then I am strong. In light of the scientific research on mystical experiences induced by psychedelics, that verse finally makes sense to me. When you allow yourself, your ego, to weaken, to dissolve, then you can come to know that the great power that animates everything, you're made of that. You are in and of it, and it is within and of you. And when you know that, not even death can scare you. Obviously, well, I hope obviously, psychedelics are not the only things that can bring about this kind of knowing. In fact, something that the leaders in this field of research seem to be convinced of is that what they are witnessing in their labs is the same kinds of mystical experiences that the prophets and poets, seekers and sages of every age have been talking about. The church has long had language around these glimpses into the ineffable divine. One of them is the exclamation, holy, holy, holy. And these truly holy, portal-like moments through which we get to connect with the God that is beyond and within and all. These moments have been induced by meditation, fasting, prayer, pilgrimage, ecstatic practices like speaking in tongues, singing, dancing, dreaming. And sometimes they just come by the grace of God. Bill Richards, who is the clinical director of the psychedelics research program at Johns Hopkins, was a former student of Abraham Maslow, the psychologist who famously developed Maslow's hierarchy of needs, in which he underscores the importance of peak experiences for self-actualization. And Richards says of his former teacher, Abe was a natural Jewish mystic. He could just lie down in the backyard and have a mystical experience. That doesn't happen to me often. But I did have a mystical experience once. In it, the universe was swirling above my head. And then I funneled that universe through my body with my breath. It moved, it cycloned through me like a hurricane, like a typhoon. It was so intense. And no, I wasn't high. I was in active labor. I felt so weak. There were moments where I thought I might die. But in my weakness, in my surrender, I felt the power of the animating force of life and love as it moved through and with me. And it still moves me, obviously, because then in that state of consciousness, when I looked into the eyes of my son for the first time, I saw the eyes of God. In his weak littleness, I saw the power of eternity, so ageless and so new, all at once. And my experience is not unique, because as we know, kids are portals to the divine. As one developmental psychologist put it, babies and children are basically tripping all the time. So I'd like to close with the words of Jesus, who said, "Unless you change and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." Throughout this day and throughout this week and year, let's take time to let down our guard, to quiet that default mode, to open ourselves to the strange, to the beautiful, to the holy, that we may too be transformed by the renewing of our minds. Amen.